Just once. All right, Lee, we'll give everybody a few minutes to join. It looks like you're muted, so hold on one second. We're gonna.
There we go. How's that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Are we live right
We
now?
are live right now, so we're just going to give
Cool.
1 or 2 minutes to see if we've got any people joining, and we'll get started in just a second. Apologize for the delay for anybody joining. All right, just about 20 more seconds, everyone.
My screen keeps blurring right now. There we go.
All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right, greetings, everyone. Happy Thursday. Is it already Thursday?
Thursday, yeah.
Let me just check one. We got one more thing for our friends on one more quick second, and then we'll get started. Just trying to see if we can get our LinkedIn friends on for live there. All right, and one more second. So Lee, I apologize for the details. The first time we're trying to do the LinkedIn live, so we'll give it probably about 20 seconds more, and if not, we'll just go with the live stream that people are on right now. All right, we'll go ahead and skip the LinkedIn live and get started. So Lee, happy Thursday. Greetings, everyone. If you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. You can do a Q&A or chat, both should be enabled. So just feel free to put it in there and we'll capture them a little bit later in the program. Aaron, can you go ahead and also post, I know last time a lot of people had asked for the ROI calculator link. Can you post that in the chat link? That is something a lot of times people, when they're talking, crazy budget seasons, certainly been a crazy year for everybody in tech land. A lot of people are thinking about, hey, if I drive better enterprise reliability, if I do a better job with incidents, and retrospectives, what does that mean to our company? So we've got a calculator that's free. You can use to calculate what that looks like. So again, Aaron will drop that in the chat as we go if you have any questions around that. So a little bit about me before we'll get to you, Lee. My name is Ken Gavranovic, COO of Blameless. In prior lives, I was the founder of web.com back when, people think the internet might be a thing, my 20s. Done a lot of different things, done transformation at Cox, Auto Trader, Kelly Blue Book. You and I worked together at New Relic, and ran product and engineering. So been doing this work for Google funded startups, but I'm really, really excited about joining Blameless. And what I'm excited about, it's never really about selling software products. It's really about solving problems. And when I think about reliability, that's such a costly thing to enterprises. And so being able to share best practices that you've seen, I've seen, and really just help, companies and teams get better is pretty exciting to me. So with that, Lee, I want you to tell us a little bit. I know you're an Amazon best-selling author. You've got 2 O'Reilly books. I want you to share which ones, and you invented, which I always think this is pretty cool because this is before we met, AWS Beanstalk. What else should anybody know about you as you share your thoughts?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm glad to be here, Ken. It's always great working with you, and I love working with you on all the projects that we work on together. But I've been in the industry for well over 30 years, almost 35 years, and anywhere from working in a hardware company like Hewlett Packard all the way to cloud-centric organizations like AWS. And I've been involved in the early development of the cloud. As you mentioned, I developed the Elastic Beanstalk, which was one of the first infrastructure platform as a service offerings, I should say, for the cloud for AWS. It was our first foray outside of infrastructure as a service into platform as a service. I worked at Amazon for almost 8 years. Then I worked in New Relic for another 7 years. And now I work on my own doing consulting for other companies on their cloud modernization strategy, as well as create content, books, articles, things like that, both for myself, for to sell, as well as for other companies for content, literature, and content creation purposes. I currently have 3 books. Architecting for Scale from O'Reilly Media is my mainstay. I have one from O'Reilly on overcoming IT complexity, and my most recent book, you can see back there, is the one I did with you, Ken, which is a Business Breakthrough 3.0. It's much more of a business-focused book, but very much related to modernizing your enterprise.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the big challenges, especially having, both of us worked in with some of the largest global companies, is, it's one thing to buy a SaaS tool. It's one thing to have an idea, but driving change in organization, it's always people, process, and technology. And oftentimes technology is the easiest. So I love to talk about people and process because that's the biggest part that gets a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's maybe the biggest difference between my books is the earlier books focused on technology, the later ones focused on technology, as well as the systems and processes, the people involved in doing that. So they both worked on processes, but my early focus was on technology. My later focus is on the business itself.
Yep. So let's dive in. I think the first question some people might have is we're going to talk about Agile retrospectives and incident retrospectives. And, a lot of times people they know the difference, but, if you wanted to kind of sum it up, I would say from my perspective, an Agile retrospective really focuses on reflecting on kind of the previous sprint, right? Aiming to refine the team's approach. On the other hand, incident retrospective really zeroes in on a particular incident or issue that happened to learn and prevent future occurrences. Curious, what did I miss in that? The difference?
No, I think that's a good definition, but I think there's going a little bit more than that. I think Agile retrospectives are a regular, reoccurring process as part of your Agile sprint process. Every sprint, when you complete the sprint, you do a retrospective to see how you performed in that sprint. That's a regular part of your process, regular part of your engineering culture, at least it should be. An incident retrospective occurs after an event, a customer-facing incident occurred that impacts your customers or impacts your business or impacts your product. And it's to try and figure out why that event occurred and how to prevent it from happening. So I don't want to say that they're not regular, because they should happen every time you have an incident, but they're irregular from the standpoint that they occur when something happens versus on a regular recurring schedule.
No, I agree. I think you and I've had a lot about risk matrix and severity, because, if it's something that really didn't impact anybody, to do a retrospective on an incident correctly actually takes a lot of engineers' time, takes a lot, maybe even out of leadership. If not done right, it could take a lot. Just could be a very expensive process. And I just wanted to comment, I always find it interesting that sometimes you still run into people who run an Agile shop that don't do retrospectives. And one thing I think that's the same is they're both about continuous improvement. One's about continuous improvement in that Agile team. And if you don't have that, the team's not improving. They're not figuring out how they can go faster, how they can have less bugs, how they can, manage the delicate balance of feature requests and tech debt. I think it's really, really important. So I just encourage anybody that's listening to this, if you don't do Agile retrospectives, maybe tune into what we're going to talk through. And Lee, if it's okay, I'd love for you to share some maybe AWS examples. It's always fun to hear some of the early AWS approaches.
Sure. So, I was involved in Elastic Beanstalk at AWS very early in the cloud history, right? This was like year 2 or year 3 of AWS being created. So the cloud was a brand new thing, right? And we were just trying to figure out what it was and how it worked. And so we were a little bit light initially on agile processes. You know, agile was critical to Amazon and AWS, but we didn't yet have, you know, unified or sophisticated universal processes in place in order to run them. You know, each team essentially did things differently, and they tuned their process for the people in that team, which, by the way, is a good strategy in general. But one of the problems with that approach is we didn't have really good agile, you know, company-wide agile tooling in place yet. We had good CI/CD and we had good analytics, I mean, extremely good, you know, world-class analytics and monitoring tools. Everything was home built, but we didn't have much more as far as standardized tooling beyond that. So it's up to each individual team to produce the tools and processes that you wanted to use to make that happen. So agile retrospectives, unfortunately, were a little bit hit or miss initially, depending on the team. You know, for Beanstalk, we did retrospectives after every sprint, and the way we did them was they were lightweight, and they were completely and totally run by the developers. I wasn't even invited. I wasn't allowed to attend them because we wanted them focus on the developers and the developer experience. So they met, didn't spend a ton of time on them, but got the core learnings for what it takes to apply to the next sprint, and then they applied that to the next sprint and sprint planning process moving forward. Where that varied was if we had a major problem in one of the sprints, either because of unscoped work or, you know, distractions from management causing issues, or something else external that caused the sprint to go awry. And then we would do a little bit more of a major retrospective to understand what happened and what was the impact of that. But other than that, we tried to keep them lightweight and have them completely developer focused without any management involvement whatsoever. But incident retrospectives, we want to hold off on incidents?
Yeah, hold off on incident just for a second. So
okay.
I want to dig in a little bit more on agile retrospectives. So I agree, and I think you hit on something that's really important, because I've heard a lot of people like want to implement agile retrospectives, and then the manager wants to show it, or maybe some team they think's high performer or low performer, and then, you know, leadership wants to drop in. I think it's so important to trust the team, like set expectations. You know, like I'm a big fan, first of all, of fixed sprints, but, you know, not everybody has to be that. But I think if you give the team the space, I always say, listen, the company's giving you this space, they're investing. It's expensive to have, you know, pizza box, let's call it 6 to 8 developers, you know, and whoever else is around the team, probably the product manager, if there's a product owner, you know, the Q&A team, but it really should be the whole team. And sitting there and spending an hour or more to do things like team temps, to talk about what went right, what went wrong, that's a big investment. The company's trusting the team. That's why I always like to explain, hey, the company's investing in you and trusting you. Now you guys have to take advantage of this time so that you have continuous improvement. So, you know, if you have somebody that's not holding their weight in the team, that should be a team discussion. If right. Done right, if Agile's done right, it shouldn't be the manager that has to come in and say, hey, so-and-so's not holding their weight. The team already knows that, they've already addressed it. You know, and likewise, if maybe they're getting too many feature requests, and so, you know, their service level objective is, you know, way off, you know, hopefully the team then's talking about that. Hey, this is why that's happening. And it's amazing, I think, what teams can come up with if you give them that space. I remember I was with one company that was doing automation for car trading. So it was an automated dealer-to-dealer wholesale trading platform. And by giving the team the space, they came to leadership, I was that, and said, hey, you know, you told us to take the time, and the bottom line, we figured that we're wasting about 30% of our capacity on these 3 tech debt things. If we could get 2 sprints, we can knock that out. And so I was like, hold on. So in 2 sprints, you can save 30% of your time. And they're like, yes. I'm like, that's a no-brainer investment.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing they should be able to come to you with, right? You know, it's the best retrospectives don't have the management involved, but the engineers come to the conclusions and then bring those up as proposals to management afterwards, right? Like this. It's like and that's what happened in Beanstalk. If they needed something from me, they reached out to me as a team with a team decision about what they needed, and that worked great. But you don't want to be involved in the day-to-day nitty-gritty as a manager, day-to-day nitty-gritty sprint tasks and the retrospective afterwards. You want the team to handle that, so the team owns the outcome, not you.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, having been in AWS where retros, and these days, of course, retros are very important at AWS because that was kind of the beginning of the Agile transformation.
That was the start. Yep.
and all those type of things. But I would just say is I know firsthand whether you have 20 developers or you have 4,000 developers, this approach of having a retrospective, if you think about it, what it does from a process design perspective is you've got these little now groups of teams. Maybe they're running micros. Maybe you've got 1,000. Like we talk to companies that have 1,000 different teams. So just, and that's thousands of developers. But if they can get and talk through these things in the retro, you basically create small little microcosms where people are making decisions, and that really increases your enterprise agility. So it's a big win. So again,
and your scalability.
Yeah,
your
and
organization scalability. Yeah,
totally. So I always think about, like, sometimes people ask, like, okay, so what are kind of the key things to know that you're doing an Agile retrospective right? Like, what's the checklist? And so I've got a couple of these. See if I miss anything. I think the first part, if the team's, starting it and they've never done it, is establish a welcoming environment, right? This is not about blaming, that's why I work at Blameless. This is about, the teams, engaging, and it's about continuous improvement. It's about, like, the past is a history lesson. Let's not get excited about the past, but let's learn from the past to have different outcomes in the future. Highlight successes, like celebrate wins. We all need to do that. Like, we can always talk about all the things that aren't going right, but what is going right? How do you highlight the successes? Spot improvement areas. So where's that continuous improvement? Propose solutions, not more problems, solutions. Right. Allocate tasks and ensure follow-ups. Because one of the things, like, I've seen in retrospectives that are not great, hey, we identified this. Next topic. Okay, wait, who's going to do something about that? Maybe they need to talk to leadership. Maybe they need to do whatever, but you need to say, okay, I've got this one. I've got that one. That one's going to go in a Jira board. Anything else that's kind of good practices?
Sure. That particular one is a big hot button of mine. When people say, here's a problem, fix it, and expect you to solve the problem, when I'd much rather than come saying, here's a problem, here's what we recommend to do to fix it. And then that becomes so much easier. It shows they've put the thought process into what it takes to resolve the issue already. And that makes my job as a manager much easier. I think a couple of things that I think are important. One is to make sure that everyone, other than management, that everyone involved in the sprint, or everyone involved in the process of the development is involved in the sprint. So whether we're talking product managers, support, Q&A, as well as the engineering team itself, everyone at the engineering level should be involved in the sprint. And also, everyone's going to have an opinion. Not everyone's going to agree with the opinion. Blameless is important, but respect is also important. You want a culture where people are willing to speak up, come up with very odd, strange ideas and just throw them out there and have it be okay. So you want to be able to respect opinions, respect people's beliefs, and make a non-blameless culture. And, you and I talk about this a lot, Ken. SMART goals are incredibly important to be able to set the direction for the team. And the SMART goals should be reviewed, should be part of the retrospective as well. In general, data should be you're not doing Agile right if you're not collecting data, and that data should be reviewed and should be actionable, and that's all part of the SMART goals.
Yeah, totally. And the last one I was thinking also maintain a constructive atmosphere. If you get somebody that's going in the wrong direction, I think that's super important. And I've seen people just because I know sometimes people come to us like, how do I improve my enterprise velocity? And oftentimes that's like, how do I build software faster, better, higher quality? I've seen companies have a 20% uplift in their velocity just by doing retros right. So it's something that's really a big benefit to your company. The other part, I think I would wanted to just share a couple of things. Also, like, so that's what you should do. Here's some things I think you shouldn't do. And I'll hit on a couple, and Lee, you jump in if there's some other ones you have. I think turning it into a venting session. Like, if that's what's happening, that's not how you should run a retro. Lingering on past issues. Like, as a leader, like, I've seen so many times where something happens, and I always say, listen, what happened in the past is a history lesson. Let's focus on what we can learn from it versus like browbeating or finger pointing. That's just, it not only is it ineffective, it just doesn't make any sense, right? Jumping to solutions, right? That's and engineers, like you and I are both start off as developers. We're problem solvers.
Right.
And
you give me a problem, I want to solve it.
Yeah, totally. And most of the debates get on the tactics. So if you think about like when you've had something, maybe it's like everybody's focused on the tactics. That's what people debate. What you want to focus on is what's the problem to solve, because usually there's much more alignment on the problem to solve, and that's the action item. Suppress disagreements, allowing a single voice to kind of shout over everyone. Don't want to have that. Taking criticism personally, even if you made a mistake and blew up the sprint, it's okay. It's about learning from it. If it keeps happening, maybe that's a challenge, right? But if it's doing that, and then the last one I would say is follow up. If you have a lot of issues, maybe management needs to solve that problem. Somebody needs to go take it to management as an action item. If you just have the retro and don't talk about action items and somebody doesn't follow up, it's not very valuable. Anything else, Lee?
Well, that's a great list. I think that I think you've covered it all, but I do want to stress a couple of things here. One of the things I see as a common outcome with these sorts of with the Agile retrospectives is, since they occur regularly, it is so easy to get into the habit of talking about the same things every time, and so that tends to encourage the we're having this problem over and over again. We're just not solving it, and we're having the same problem and reviewing the same things over and over and over again, and not doing anything about it. You want to avoid that process. Everything should be new and fresh and relevant to the last sprint, and everything that is a challenge should have a follow-up that is resolved before the next sprint, as much as possible before the next sprint, or at least a plan in place to deal with it before you start the next sprint.
I think even the wording, what are we, not me, what are we as a team going to do about this? And then who's on point to drive that? Because if all of us are on point, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, every issue that needs follow-up has to have an owner, a single person that's responsible for it. That doesn't mean it's their job to fix it. It's their job to make sure it gets done.
Makes sense. All right, let's shift gears a little bit, and let's now talk about incident retrospective. So it's the cousin, but these are the things that get people stressed out. Like when you have a big outage, these are the things that cost companies a ton of money. These are the things that oftentimes the way many enterprises do it are inefficient. That's one of the reasons why I joined Blameless is like automating that whole flow, making it easier for engineers and the companies to do incident management and retrospectives. But I would say the crux of an incident is really aiming for its non-reoccurrence. That's, the learning, right? The learning from it. I think sometimes, common misconception is that it's merely resolving, communicating, and recording. I've seen many type of incident retrospectives. I call them history lessons. This happened at this thing, this we fixed it and all is good. Well, that's not really going to drive non-recurrence.
Right.
It really is much, much more developing preventative measures, leveraging real-time dashboards for monitoring. So it's really about like, what are the things that we could do to make this, I call it do not repeat plan, to make it not happen again. Who's going to do it? When are we going to do it? How are we going to make sure and track that we actually do it within the timeline and it gets prioritized? Because we've all seen the ones where you have an incident, the things don't get prioritized, or maybe it was a history lesson. and then the exact same thing happens again, which is really tough, not only on the team, but also on their leaders.
And the other thing is you want to focus on root causes, right? I've seen so many incident retrospectives where it was, the application went down. Well, why did the application go down? And the result of the retrospective was we had a database failure. And that was the end of the retrospective. Because the database failed. We rebooted it. Everything's fine. Well, why did the database fail? What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Why did it happen at this particular point in time? Is there some other root cause that isn't resolved that could cause this to happen again? Why? Keep asking why until you come to the true root cause. And so many retrospectives give the superficial answer as to what happened, as you called it, the history lesson, and don't get into the root cause of what actually is the root issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and if you haven't read the book, The 5 Whys is very powerful, because what you just hit on, my guess is everybody that's watching this webinar has had something where somebody did a bad query. Mm-hmm. And if you're not careful, the retrospective says, somebody did a bad query, they shouldn't do that. That's not the solution.
I had a client just recently do exactly that, where it was a bad query, and the result of the retrospective was somebody did a bad query, and that caused the database to fail. And I was like, no, that's not a retrospective. That's a summary of the history of the incident, but it's not a root cause. It's not a retrospective. You have to keep asking why until you find the real reason why something happened.
Yeah, no, totally.
Why did you do the query? What was wrong with that query? Why shouldn't they have done that query? When should they have done the query instead? What should they have done differently in the query to make sure this problem doesn't occur? Blah, 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 blah. All
right,
those.
What monitoring can we put in? So even if we miss all of that, we hit it, we capture it before it goes to production. So
absolutely,
totally agree. And when we talk about, of course, the retrospective, this is well after you already had your incident, you had to fix everything. It was stressful. Maybe you had leadership, you're having to do updates. Somebody's, constantly bugging you for updates to communicate to everybody. Then, many companies, when they do the retro, they're going back and looking at emails and Jira tickets and, Slack channels, to get up to this point, a lot of things have happened. So it's so important to really build that do not repeat plan. And, and it's so inefficient for so many organizations, having worked at Fortune 50 companies and, seeing calls where, it could cost $50 million and 15 minutes of outage. It's pretty high stakes, high stress type situation. And, that's actually, Lee, if I'm doing just a quick plug for everybody, I won't do many plugs for Blameless, but, that's what got me excited to come to Blameless is for enterprises. They've modernized the way they do services. Maybe they're in public cloud, but a lot of times the way they do incident management, retrospectives is still very much the old way. It's very manual. And so, it's $100 billion problem. And, what's really nice to see is when you implement the right process, you automate it, companies from Zapier to Ticketmaster, Under Armour, like we've seen them save, 35% of their engineers' time, like have incidents go down. So it's not only important to do it right, but to automate it. It really helps the companies a lot. Lee, I don't know if you can share, but I'm curious, like, in big incidents or things you could share at AWS, like talk about high stakes. Like sometimes I was actually on a call, somebody asked me to, help them as a private equity fund that had bought a bunch of SaaS companies, and they're going to the public cloud, and they're like, hey, should we go to AWS, Google, and 3 public clouds? And I'm like, well, you could, but if you go to AWS and Google and they totally go down all regions, pretty much the internet's down at this point. But right. Can you share any AWS experiences? Because when AWS goes down, let's face it, if it's a full region, big parts of the internet go down too.
Oh, exactly. And I'll tell you that was actually a big fear early in the days of AWS. So, I was involved literally from the beginning of the cloud with AWS, and in the early days, for many years, first of all, Amazon's always had a focus on customer and customer expectations, and that carried through into AWS, and that's how we did our incident retrospectives as well was focused on customer metrics. We actually considered an incident any time that a customer metric changed in an unexpected way. It didn't matter if it was an outage or not. If there was a latency increase that was unexplainable, that's an incident. And that was reviewed weekly we had what we called Wednesday review meetings. And they had all of the senior leadership from the company, all the way up to and including, Andy Jassy and Adam Slutsky were there every week at these meetings, reviewing, looking at charts, reviewing analytics to try and figure out why certain things were going on. And you, as a leader of a particular offering, had to understand your metrics and the impact of those metrics in order to survive the meeting, so to speak. And that was a part of the core culture of the company. And what that led to was the first several years of the cloud, AWS had no major outage. And that was actually becoming an issue for a while, a concern of ours, because the cloud was new. We were expecting people to move workloads into the cloud, but no one knew what would really happen if AWS had an outage and what that would mean to cloud adoption. And so there was a kind of a pent-up demand or pent-up stress in the organization for waiting for our first major outage to occur. And I remember when it occurred, I don't remember the specifics of what caused the outage, but I believe it was an EC2 control plane availability issue that caused EC2 instances not to be controllable. And that was a major outage. We dealt with it, we fixed it, we resolved it. Very short order, went pretty fast, lots of follow-up afterwards. But the tension was relieved because customers didn't go away, plans didn't majorly change. The internet now knew what it was like for a major cloud service to go down, and the result was the world survives. Okay, and that was really what the concern was. And now the survivability of your applications in the light of outages is a central tenet to how you build a cloud application, and the processes and systems for what it takes to actually build an application in the cloud. Things like plan for failure and all those sorts of things. Those tenets came out of those early days when it was like, well, what do we do if our infrastructure goes down and we don't control the infrastructure? It's not in our control anymore. Somebody else is controlling it. What do we do? And so a lot of the mindset as far as what it takes to build a high quality, high available cloud application today was built in those early days and was part of this model. And it all came out of this tension for the first outage as it came up. I have one other Amazon story as far as how important outages can be. And this is like 2006, I think, when I was very early in my days at Amazon, before AWS even existed. We were moving the Amazon retail storefront from a monolithic application to a service-based architecture. It was a multi-year project. Jeff Bezos was the one who instigated the project. It was a major project, multiple years. And at one point in time, during this project, I was owning the homepage of Amazon. And we had this incident where we set a feature flag, someone set a feature flag incorrectly, and the entire homepage disappeared. If you went to Amazon.com, you got a blank page. And that was a major incident. And we fixed it. It was about a 10 or 15-minute incident, but it was simply because of a feature flag that was misused. And we had a retrospective afterwards. We figured out what happened. And we were using feature flags in a way very different than the rest of the company was at the time. And we changed our processes for how we used them to try to avoid those sorts of problems in the future. And we had what we called New York Times events back then. Anytime that Amazon failed, it was front page news in the New York Times. And so our goal was to keep the systems up and running, was to avoid New York Times events. And this was a case where obviously we didn't. But the issue was quickly resolved, but it was a very expensive outcome. Imagine Amazon.com going down for 15 minutes and the impact on revenue on the company. huge impact, obviously, and so figuring out how to prevent that from happening again isn't just a nicety and a improving a metrics issue. It's a keeping the business from going under. It's if we kept having problems like that during this entire migration, we wouldn't have completed the migration. We would have had to stop because a business couldn't have survived it.
No, it makes total sense. And I would say is, again, challenge everybody to make it not a history lesson. Like we talked about the database that's so common with the queries. But I'm going to give you an example too. Is I won't mention all the details always because I figure out what I signed when. I was going to be careful. But all to say is a major public website that everybody was familiar with was one of the hundreds of applications I had in a much more previous role, at a Fortune 50 company, and it came to my attention that someone had, to the production database, done a set update and forgot the where clause. And basically it said all pictures for products to the same thing. And so I got involved and it was, I think I was like 7 o'clock and I think we had it fixed at 5 a.m. But, so we've got it before busy hours. But in the retro, everybody's like, well, that's because there are gaps where there's no administration in the software. And so there was no other way for people to do it. And so for years, they had been making production database and they were going to say oh, there's nothing we could do. And I'm like, there's always something we could do. We need to change that assumption. And, one of my favorite phrases to make sure are included in incident is, given the same set of circumstances, with whatever we've said we're going to do, the do not repeat plan, the things that we're going to do, would this happen again? Of course, there's some times where there's nothing you can do, but that's usually rare. There's usually something you can do. And if you say, hey, if we did these action items, would we have a different outcome? If the answer's, no, then, let's dig into that a little bit more. Let's go back to, I know we're running out of time and I want to make sure we have some time for questions, Lee. Let's go to some frequent mistakes for incident retrospectives. I'll give a couple and then see if you have any more. I think, one is insufficient data gathering. That's, again, small plane for Blameless. That's where you want to automate that data gathering. Not having all of the players in there, key participants, hostile environment, placing blame. That's why I love our name, Blameless, over learning, right? This is a learning exercise, vague action steps, and then not following through. You have to have a dashboard that's capturing, whether it's in Jira or ServiceNow. If it's only the ServiceNow team happens and they run a report, you need to have a real-time dashboard understanding all of those action items. I think that's super important. Anything else, Lee, that you could think of that you're not shooting like a bad incident retrospective?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go to fruitful.
Notice that list is very similar to the list for Agile retrospectives, because in fact, the process can be very similar. The results are different, the expectations are different, the reasons why you do them are different, but a lot of the same philosophies still apply. You want to gather data. Data is critical to being able to make decisions. You want everyone involved. You don't want to blame people because that turns people off from solving solutions, finding solutions to problems. And even identifying what the problems are. People don't want to bring up problems if they're going to be blamed for them on a regular basis. And so it's very similar sort of processes there in doing it. Now, the steps, the reason why you do it and the steps you take afterwards, the follow-ups are different. But the general process of the incident response itself is very, very similar to the Agile retrospective.
Makes sense. And again, I heard we had some problems in the Q&A. Just feel free to use the chat if you have some questions. I'm going to try to wrap it up soon so we can see if we do. I think we've got a few questions, Lee. I'll just throw out and I'll say it a little bit slower in case anybody wants to take a note. There's certain tools that you might use for kind of digging into. One's called the fishbone diagram, the 5 whys technique. I think we shared that early. And also kind of impact mapping. So those are, again, you could ping us offline. We'd be happy to share more details on that. Lee, before we wrap up and take some questions, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, sure. They can reach me at leeatchison.com, which is where I have all my current books and courses and articles listed there. Or if you want to talk to me directly, LinkedIn is a great way to reach me. And assuming in the show notes for this, we will have my contact information. I can provide you, insights in your application modernization journey. That's what I do. Whether that's helping your engineering teams in their modernization strategy, or your marketing teams and getting a message out to your customers. You need thought leadership and getting messages out to your customers. I can do that for you as well. I've worked with companies like Redis, Uptix, F5, Cockroach Labs, all have leveraged me in my thought leadership content. And meanwhile, companies like Disney and Ori, OutSystems, HP, obviously Amazon and New Relic have leveraged my technical expertise in helping them with their construction. I can help you with anything having to do with application modernization and team modernization within that.
All right. And just so everybody knows, we love helping people solve problems. So, you can certainly engage Lee. For me and Lee both, you can also just send us questions, because we get so much exposure to so many different companies of what works, what's the formula to solve this particular problem. So feel free to connect with either of us, or, one of the things we try to do at Blameless is, put blogs. Maybe Aaron, you could share some of the popular blogs that, really aren't about selling a thing, but really about educating, our fellow engineers, and people that are running software to have something that works much, much better. We'll also, I think, next week be sharing a comprehensive post on both of our channels and the Blameless channel, really covering some of these things. So if you took notes on anything, you don't have to worry about that. We'll send that out to you. If you just get connected, either one of the three of us, you'll have access to that. And Aaron, I think you already put the ROI calculator out there. If anybody, a lot of times, I think a lot of people have been going through this budget season where their budget's been cut. Many companies either have already started or are about to start their budget season. If you do enterprise reliability incident management correctly, you really can save your company a lot of time and money. So your engineers get to spend more time building software. So for the last few minutes, let's see. I think we've got a few questions. Let me see if I can pull it up on the chat, and we'll share taking one.
And we can also, if we run out of time, we can take some of the questions and answer them on LinkedIn afterwards. And
just send us questions, or if you put it in here, you can email us to it. We'll make sure to send some contacts out. And again, any questions you have, we're happy to share. Don't need anything in return. One is, how should we ensure that everyone involved in the incident is able to participate in the retrospective? Ken mentioned tooling. You want to take that, Lee, or you want me to take it?
Well, you were mentioning tooling, so why don't you talk about what you meant by that first, and we can go on from there.
Well, I don't know if it actually, for me, it does tie into tooling, but I would just say is anybody that should have information or inform your product manager, like this is not just an engineering exercise, which sometimes incident retrospectives, it's just the engineers. I think it's everybody that should be involved in that incident should be invited. They should feel comfortable. It should feel one team. That's definitely on the Agile retrospectives. But I also think in incident retrospectives, anybody that's involved, because let's face it, sometimes it's a business process that might fire off the change. I think they need to be part of that whole conversation. So let me go to the next question. How can we make sure that the results of the retrospectives are acted upon? Want to take that?
This is a cultural aspect in your company, and that is follow through of action items. And I've seen lots of companies who have a culture that doesn't have follow through as part of the culture. But you have to have that as an ingrained part of your core beliefs as a company, that follow through is important. And this is the place where management can help out and can drive more too. You need to hold people accountable for the actions they've signed up to do. And if they've signed up to do specific actions, if they can't make those actions happen, they have to figure out a way to make it happen, whether it's involving other people or finding another owner for the issue if it's something that turns out they're not able to do. But once you take ownership of an issue, it's your job to drive it to conclusion, or until you find someone else to take ownership of it. And that's the important thing, is don't leave things hanging. Always make sure everything has an owner. Always make sure the owner's engaged. And if the owner needs to change, it's an active handoff.
Good. We had another question with the love links to the tools you mentioned, Fishbone and impact mapping. Any webinars. So that's great. It's great feedback. Because I always like to think like, what are the tools for that? So maybe we'll think about it as a future from a webinar. But I will say we'll have a blog post which will cover like best cases in Agile, worst cases, and also have some links to the tools. So if you're, either connected to Blameless, Lee, or myself, we'll put it out through all of those channels early next week. So you'll have those tools and, some links on how to implement those, like again, and some of these things we call them tools, but it's oftentimes even a process, like simple, like 5 whys is a really effective tool. But what does that mean is it's someone says, hey, Lee, you did a bad query, and like, yeah, I did a bad query. Okay. Why? And then I did it because I just didn't think about it. Okay. Well, why?
Yeah, be careful with the why though, that it doesn't become a blame why, right? It's like you want it to be, what happened? I did a bad query. Why was it that the query was a bad query? Is probably a better question than why did you do the query?
Well said.
And may end up coming to the same conclusion by the time you're done, but be very careful that the whys don't turn into blames.
Right. And your point is spot on, is words matter. We're all humans, right? And so how you phrase the questions can lead to a great incident retrospective or bad. One of the things I love to do at the beginning when I'm coaching a company to like do good incident retrospectives is almost read at the beginning what our goals are here. And I think some of the practices that we shared, kind of good case, hey, this is an environment where we're not going to blame, no one's going to shout over anybody else. Like just stating that at the beginning of the kickoff, we're going to use the 5 whys methodology, or we're going to use the Fishbone, or we're going to do whatever it is. And here's a link if you don't know what that is, so that people can learn. Because one of the things, especially technology people, we all love to learn and improve. All right, 2 more questions, and I think we're going to wrap up. Any tips for improving the overall quality of the retrospective? Every team in my company seems to produce retros that feel different.
Yeah, and in fact, there's good and bad to that, right? You want to give your teams the flexibility to do things that make sense for them, so that the results they give are better results. But the end result of that, unfortunately, becomes inconsistencies across the organization. I think the best way you can get both consistency and good quality results is with organizational maturity to these processes. The more you spend doing these processes, the more experiences you get, and then the best practices that some teams do and other teams don't do will start getting fed across the organization, and your processes will become much more consistent. To that end, encourage teams to talk to each other, have forums for them to talk to each other, have ways they can share what worked and didn't work, have retrospectives on your retrospectives. Those sorts of techniques actually work to be able to create the maturity you need in your organization in order to build both high quality results and that are also consistent across the organization.
I agree. And I also think having a template helps. So that way, regardless of the conversation and approach that the team has, there's certain pieces of data, going back to, we've talked about like specific action items, there's certain questions. So I'm a big fan of providing a template to the organization. So at least you've got some consistency, if not in the total approach, but in the questions that are asked. So that way, at least you're driving to that consistency. And here's our action items. Here's what we've uncovered. Here's our timelines. There's certain things I think that you want to have some consistency around.
Yeah, and my suggestion there is make your templates open-ended and asking questions. And the questions should be open-ended, why-style questions.
Totally agree. Totally agree. All right, last one. We do incident records, but they just become artifacts that never get looked at again. How should we approach changing that? And if you want, I'll follow
up. Yeah. Ownership is really the key question. That's a common problem, but I think it's common in organizations that lack ownership of follow-up, and you make sure everything that needs to be addressed from the retrospective has an owner, and that owner is held accountable for the results to get done.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that's where data is. I've been in companies, for example, that use problem tickets and ServiceNow. That's where the action items live. And almost always it also results in something getting transmitted to Jira. So then you have tickets. And if you don't have, to me, a dashboard, if you haven't articulated some SLAs and you don't have an automated system that gives people that visibility into what's done, what's not done, it just gets buried with all of the other tickets, all of the other tech debt, all of the other product features. And if it's a P1 incident, that work should be prioritized. Some of the companies I've seen that do a really good job, they have service level objectives where they actually slow down product velocity if they start to miss those things, just to make sure that it is. So I'm a big believer in data and clarity. So there's the people issue and process of doing it, but I also think having that data and dashboards help, and of course, it's one of the things, again, that I like about Blameless. I know we've talked about it, Lee, is that, making that process automated so you can build those real-time dashboards, regardless of which system you're storing those action items in. Okay, good. I think we're about over time. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and send that out. Again, we will send like a light blog that will cover a lot of the key data we've covered today. If you have any other ideas for webinars in the future that you think would be interesting to you, I know a lot of people in a lot of different companies, welcome those feedback items. And actually, I think we've got one more question. Let me just see if I can read it here. Thank you for interesting and comforting views on retrospective, which are more inspiring than often group therapy, where everyone's conditioned into a dark mood at start and keep coming back at what's wrong out of control for the team, instead of focusing what can be improved on the team. Totally agree. And I think that's really where it's great for leaders to articulate, what's the purpose, when we put out the blog post, if you've got some leaders, maybe you think the retros aren't being done, you might share it. A hope is that what we send out will be very actionable and something your company can take, even if you don't have the technology to automate it, but you can take and get better. And then if you want to reach out and contact anybody at Blameless, you can go to blameless.com/contact. We're welcome to help you too. So Lee, thank you so much. Hopefully you'll let me invite you back again in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Appreciate everybody's time. And again, feel free to reach out to me personally or Lee if you've got some ideas on something you would like to do. Like, you and I both know, Andy. And so, we really have a lot of contacts in the industry. And so we can bring in some other people that work at great companies that can share kind of the inside best practices, tips and tricks. We think that's super interesting to learn. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful Thursday.
Bye-bye.